Yeah, hi kids, it's me, the Red Panther. I hope you can see me. Uh, I don't know about the lighting here. I'm going to switch this a little bit. Uh, I'm in Vegas at the Venetian. I'm here with my wife, and she is in a conference, and I'm just goofing off. Well, actually, one of the things I'm doing is talking to my old college roommate, Iowa State wrestler Jim Duschen. Jim, as you know or may know, not know, lives here in Waterloo. And Jim, you have coached at Basic High School in Henderson for 29 years, I take it.
That's correct. I was the head coach for 29 years. I was full-time teacher and coach there. I retired in 2007.
Okay. Uh, and kids, when I talk to Jim on the phone or in person, we certainly talk about old times that we shared at Iowa State, friends we knew, and the amazing wrestling experiences that we had at Iowa State. But also, we talk about other wrestlers, and Jim has a great memory and knowledge of a lot of what happened in the past and what's going on now. One of the things Jim and I were talking about was Waterloo. Jim, you are from.
I'm from Waterloo. I graduated from East High School in 1962.
And back in those days, how was East?
East during that era was in its heyday. During the mid to late 50s through the mid 60s, it was a dynasty, as well as across the river at West High during that time.
Who's the wrestling coach at East?
Dave Natvig.
Dave Natvig.
Great coach. It was, a pleasure to have the opportunity to wrestle under his guidance.
Now tell me a little bit about where did Dave Natvig come from and where did he wrestle?
Dave Natvig came from New Hampton, small community about 40 miles north of Waterloo. He was a state champion in high school there, I think twice. And then he went on to Iowa State Teachers College, which is now University of Northern Iowa, and was an All-American there a couple of times. I believe he took second in the NCAA once there.
You don't have to give me the exact number, but just ballpark. How many years did he coach at East, do you think?
I believe he came in there in the early 50s. I'm going to say maybe 1951 might have been about his first year there, spring of 51, and I think he coached through 1969, I believe. He had 7 teams that were state championship teams, and of course, numerous individual state champions.
So during that time, you won 7 state championships, and when you were there in '62, is that what you said? 62.
Correct.
I'm sorry. Was that sort of the middle of the empire?
Yes, it was. In fact, we had won the state championship in '60 and '61 during my sophomore and junior years. We ended up taking third my senior year, behind Cedar Rapids Jefferson, who won it, and West Waterloo was second. And then the following 2 years after I graduated, East won it again.
And I'm sorry I don't remember. What weight were you back then?
I wrestled primarily 165 my senior year. I was a state qualifier that year. I ended up losing to the defending state champion, Gary Langen from Bettendorf, in the first round. There were no wrestlebacks during those days. If you lost in the first round, regardless of who you lost to, you were out.
Okay, I know we're talking about wrestling, and we certainly will. But I remember also you were a baseball player.
Yes. I started on the high school team there at East High. We were second in the state my senior year, and I was the starting center fielder on that team. I hit right at about 300 for the season batting average.
Okay, now this is a little rabbit hole I'm going to go down. And the way I know Jim is from a guy named Dick Taylor, who eventually became Tugboat Taylor. But when you guys were kids, I don't know, 12, you were the bat boy? Is that the right word?
That's correct. I was the bat boy for the Waterloo Hawks, and Dick was the bat boy for the Clinton Sea Sox. And it was quite a rivalry between those two teams. They were the two best teams in the Midwest League at that time.
And Dick Taylor was our heavyweight, and through Dick Taylor at the state meet, I met Jim Duschen in Waterloo in 1964, I think. But anyway, back to so you're at 160.
165 there.
And you're what? Are you 6 foot?
Maybe not quite. Maybe about 5'10".
You're close.
5'11".
A little stretching, you could probably make 6 if we hung you upside down.
Well, I think I grew maybe a little bit after my senior year.
But anyway, back to Waterloo. Is there just some general things that comes to your mind when you think about why were you successful? I mean, you had a good coach. We can say that, can't we, without too much reservation? Navik was.
Well, I think the success he had. I mean, it's pretty obvious. That he was a good coach, and he was a great person as well.
Good guy.
Good guy. I believe he related well to the individuals on the team, which we had quite a variety of different types of individuals that he had to deal with.
We'll get to that in a second. That's a great point. As a kid coming into high school, did the wrestlers stand out in your mind? Were they an interesting group of guys? You wanted to be a wrestler. Was there camaraderie or identity with the wrestlers at East?
Well, wrestling was popular, and of course the teams were very successful during that era, not just in wrestling but other sports as well. And I think there was a lot of pride in competing. And going kind of back, my uncle was a state champion on the 1953 team. In fact, that was the first state championship team that East had.
What's his name again?
Jack Smith. He ended
Jack
up
Smith.
being a highly successful high school coach there in Iowa at Sigourney, and did very well through the years.
And he's out there winning the state meet.
And I was in elementary school then.
You were a kid, and you saw all this stuff unfold.
Yeah, so watching him win that, while I think I was in 3rd grade, I thought, hey, that's pretty neat. That's what I want to do. Of course, I still had a lot of interest in other sports, baseball primarily, but I decided, hey, I want to wrestle.
But unlike today, you didn't start wrestling in 3rd grade.
No, there weren't any opportunities at that time to start before 7th grade when I got up to the junior high. And so that's when I started, 85 pounder, 7th grade.
7th grade, 85 pounds. And back in those days, that was junior high.
That's correct.
junior high school. Now, I'm just going to throw this in, and this isn't this generation so much, but and maybe it's not a great comparison, but guys like Danny Knight, and we're going back maybe 20 years. He started when he was 6 or 5, I don't know. And kids today can do that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We're getting off the subject a little bit, but while we're here, what do you think? When you were a coach, did you encourage a club, for instance, that had grade school kids wrestling?
Well, I think it's important for kids to get a head start, especially before they get into high school. I think the crucial age group is during junior high, which is now primarily known as middle school. And as far as the ideal time to start, I think a lot of that depends on the individual and also the way the program is administered. I think some kids maybe have come in and started maybe too young sometimes and with too much pressure put on them from outside forces. And of course now we have year-round wrestling with a lot of off-season and specialization in all sports. And I think to keep up with the other top wrestlers, you have to put in extra time. However, at the same time, you do need breaks. Wrestling is a little different than other sports. It's much as you have to put into it, the physical demands in it. I think you need to have breaks. Kids are well advanced now, and I don't even think you can compare the top wrestlers that come out of high school, say during my era or shortly after when Dan Gable came out, with the top wrestlers that are coming out today.
Okay, we'll get back to Waterloo in a second, but and I don't know this. I'm going to guess you might. How about a guy like Sanderson? I know his dad was a coach. You think he started as a kid?
Yes, Sanders, Cale, and his brothers, Cody and Cole. They started at a young age, had a lot of experience, and of course Cale, had phenomenal natural ability, probably as much as anyone that ever wrestled. And he was well advanced by the time he got out of high school.
I myself was involved in a program called the Jets with Bob Anderson, and it was an Olympic development program for kids, and it was age 6 to 18, and for the most part it worked out, and those kids for the most part did well for themselves. But here's the deal. I'm not saying it's a dirty little secret, but and again, maybe it's the parents, the kid, who knows, a lot of different factors. Some of those kids burn out, and when by the time they get to high school, they want nothing to do with wrestling. Maybe it's a sort of a rarity, but I've seen it happen. Real talented, state and national ranked young kids that they get to a point where they just don't want to do it.
Well, I always felt that for the most part that burnout is primarily mental. You can burn out physically as well, but a lot of it I think is mental. And even back during my era, I feel, looking back, there were certain individuals that were burned out during that time. And I think a lot of that was primarily due to pressure from outside forces. I always felt you have to put pressure on yourself to succeed in this sport. It has to come from within. You have to have a passion for the sport, and you have to want to do it for yourself first. And you can't do it for somebody else.
So simply stated, I don't want to reinvent the wheel here, but some kids are able to do this when they're 6 and continue with it. But some kids might be better off if they waited till they were a little older. It's just sort of a matter of individuals. But we can both agree that today most kids are starting young,
Well,
or at least the availability's there.
first of all, I think it has to be fun. And as time goes on, I mean, if an individual wants to continue wrestling on through high school and beyond, you realize that it's not all fun. A lot of hard work involved, but at the same time, you have to enjoy it. If you're not enjoying it, it's going to be very difficult to continue.
And there's the danger of parents trying to live their lives or relive their lives to their kids, which ends up in a disaster for the most part. But wait a minute, I'm sorry. Let's get back to Waterloo. It's in the 60s. Waterloo has 2 public schools, if I remember, East and West. East is, in my memory, very different from West, and I'm gonna use the word blue collar. I don't know if that's fair, but when I think of those back in those days, I think of East as being more of a blue collar high school. Am I correct?
Somewhat. Looking back, actually West was primarily blue collar as well, but considered maybe had a little more wealth on that side than the East side. But
and when we're talking blue collar, we're talking John Deere and Rath.
Well, it was a prosperous era.
There were some big factories there.
Yes, and there was, I think, most people were employed by those plants. A lot of the people in Waterloo, and it was prosperous era.
And you can't talk about this without saying that racially there was more of a mix at East, at least in my memory, than West. In other words, East had more black athletes or more black students. Could you put it that way?
Well, yes, during that era, definitely. I think, West didn't have hardly any blacks during that period of time.
Predominantly white school.
Yes.
Back in the 60s. But East was more mixed. And some of the guys you wrestled with, some of the black guys ended up at Iowa State. I'm thinking Willie Hoosman, state champ for East. And what about Bill Sadler?
Or David
Or
Sadler?
Dave Sadler, I'm sorry.
Yes, David wrestled there at Iowa State as well. David was a two-time state champion there at East. And earlier, before my time there at Iowa State, Virgil Carr came out of East High, was a two-time state champion at East, and then also ended up being a two-time All-American there at Iowa State.
In addition to those guys, you also had the Buzzards. Bob and Don Buzzard, legends from East Waterloo. And Bob was older than you?
Yes, Bob was 2 years ahead of me, and Don was 2 years behind me. So I did have the opportunity, actually, of wrestling there with both of them.
And Bob was a lighter weight.
Yes, Bob was actually state champion at 95 when he was a sophomore. And I think he won it at 127 his senior year. He took second his junior year at 112, I believe.
Don heavyweight.
Well, heavier weights. Well, Don started out, actually had the opportunity to compete there as a freshman and took second in the state as a freshman in the 120-pound class.
Really?
Yeah. The next year, he was at 138, had an outstanding season. Unfortunately, didn't make it to state that year. It was, of course, our district was very tough. And then his senior year, he won the state at 100 in the 165-pound class. His junior year, rather. And then his senior year, he won it in the 180-pound class.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was, 180. And he wrestled Dick Taylor from Clinton in the finals.
Not in the finals, in the
Or not in the finals, in the
first round.
first round. While we're on it, wasn't he an alternate to the Olympic team?
Yes. After senior in high school, he was an alternate in Greco-Roman on the 1964 team. They didn't take the alternates to the Olympics during those years, but Don was one of the more highly recruited high school wrestlers in the country during that time.
So you're sandwiched in between those generations.
Yes.
And Bob eventually. Wait a minute. Let's go back. Before Dale Anderson, was he from West or East?
Dale was at West.
He was another prominent wrestler back then in those days. He was West, and of course Dan Gable. No introduction need be made. Was at West, and he was a few years younger than you. But you knew about Dan Gable, of course.
Oh yes. I think by the time Dan entered high school, everyone was pretty well aware that he was coming up to the high school and would be a force to be reckoned with.
And eventually, Bob Buzzard ends up at Iowa State, along with Don. And by that time, he's maybe up one class, 191.
Yes. Don entered there as a 191 pounder. Well, at that time, we had an outstanding wrestler at 177, Tom Peckham.
Tom Peckham from Cresco?
Yes, was two-time NCAA champion.
Do you remember him as a kid, or when you were? Do you remember him wrestling in high school?
Yes, he came out the same year I did, out of high school, and he was undefeated his last 3 years in high school there.
Wow.
At Cresco.
3 years?
Yes.
Man. So these guys all end up at Iowa State. And you take kind of a year off, and you're working on the railroad.
Well, actually, a couple years. I ended up working for the Illinois Central Railroad. That was my second year out of high school. And I continued working there until into the following year when I entered Iowa State winter quarter, which was about the first week in December. Back then, Iowa State was on the quarter system.
And probably Bob Buzzard was instrumental in you coming there.
Yes, he was. He was primarily responsible for getting me there. And, without his efforts, doubtful had I have ever wrestled there. And
I would also add that Bob Buzzard was instrumental getting me to Michigan, where I wrestled with Bobby Douglas and Bob Buzzard Greco, and also Bob Buzzard helped get me to Athletes in Action, where I wrestled freestyle. So Bob Buzzard, he turns up in my life as well. You go to Iowa State, and you got Don Buzzard, Tom Peckham, Steve Shippos, Ted Toonstra. Am I leaving anybody out?
Well, those were primarily the main wrestlers in the upper weights. We also had an individual that had been a high school state champion out of Waverly, that group, Jim Holman, who wrestled varsity 191 and heavyweight.
So you got dropped into the middle of some of the toughest guys in the United States.
Well, upon entering there, yes. By the time I had come in as a freshman, the following year I redshirted. Most of those guys, well, Don was still there, of course, Don Buzzard, and Ted Toonstra was still there for another year as a heavyweight.
Let me ask you, just in case people don't remember or know this, Ted Toonstra was like, what, 6'5", 6'7"? I don't remember.
Ted, I would say, probably was about 6'7".
6'7".
And close to 300.
Close to 300. and I don't know how to say this without... He wasn't like typical heavyweight either. I mean, Ted could move.
Well, Ted was a good athlete. He also started on the football team. He was a lineman there.
Ted was a heck of an athlete. A big man, and he could move, and a good workout partner.
Well, yeah, he was. He was all American there at heavyweight.
And then we're talking national champion, and also Olympian, Peckham. He ended up, what did he place in the Olympics? Third?
Ended up fourth.
Fourth.
During that time. He lost one match, I believe, to an individual that was a silver medalist. He drew with the defending Olympic champion from, trying to think if the Russian. And that was, I think, the only time Tom actually wrestled any international competition was in the 1968 Olympics.
And won the nationals for Iowa State.
Yes, twice.
And Don Buzzard, All-American. Was he runner-up twice?
Don was runner-up twice, yes. At 191.
At 191. And so you're up there with some of the toughest guys in wrestling history. Not to mention, a lot of these guys, like we were talking about, were from East Waterloo.
Well, didn't want to interject. You know, Steve Shippos was another one.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Steve Shippos.
Steve was from Ithaca, New York, and Steve was also an All-American heavyweight there at Iowa State.
Tougher than nails.
Yes, he was.
Great competitor.
Extremely tough.
So you got yourself, the two Buzzards, Dave Sadler, Willie Hoosman. Am I forgetting anybody?
Well, Virgil Carr had been there previously during the early 60s.
Virgil Carr, another East Waterloo guy.
And then later on, trying to think, well, Kyvan Gadsden, who's presently wrestling at Iowa State, achieved All-American honors this past year as a sophomore. He's got 2 more years left.
East Waterloo.
Yeah, 2-time state champion at East.
An amazing history and legacy. Although now, And when I was in high school, certainly Waterloo was the powerhouse. But the tides have shifted, and I'd have to say that Bettendorf, Danny Knight, Assumption with Bush, and perhaps Iowa City, the state powerhouses have kind of shifted. Do you see anything in the future that might shift it back to Waterloo?
Well, I think it's more difficult today. I don't think it's just a matter that wrestling has gone downhill in Waterloo, as also as much as wrestling's gotten better a lot of other places than it was. So there's a lot more competition statewide. We have some outstanding coaches out there, some of these schools, and it's a matter of of coaches in Waterloo getting the kids out and keeping them going. And and that's not an easy task. It never has been. Comes down to coaches being able to motivate as far as inspiring individuals to stay with the sport and keep competing.
Is there any kids on the Waterloo scene? And I know you're far from. I mean, after all, kids. Jim lives in Las Vegas. But any kids in Waterloo that pop out in your mind that on the horizon?
I understand there's an upper weight wrestler that's at West Waterloo right now. I think his last name's Harrington. He's a state champion, and from what I understand, he's a good prospect.
Okay, now I don't expect you to be Nostradamus, but just from what you know, and you're out here in Nevada, but next year, any predictions on who's going to win the state?
That I'm not that familiar with as far as some of the top teams, as far as what they have back. I know the teams that have been successful recently more than likely will be again. I know Waverly Shell Rock has been a dominant power as of late, as well as Iowa City West, Bettendorf, and in the other classes, you have these teams that have done real well. Gilbertville, Don Bosco has been a power in single A.
Well, there you have it, kids. Been a real pleasure talking to Jim Duschen here in Las Vegas. And Jim, we'll do this again and we'll talk about some more stuff. Thank you very much, Jim.
You're welcome, John.